Yeah.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're just opening this up so everybody else gets woven in. We'll give a moment for everybody to come into the meeting. Maggie, could you make me a co-host as well, please? Thanks. Okay, just give it a second. I'm actually going to put up a slides as people land in so they know where they are. Okay, welcome folks. We'll get going just a second as we get everybody woven into the meeting. It just takes a moment to get everybody actually into the meeting. Those of you who are observing today, hang on just a moment and we'll get going. Okay. I think we're good to go. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of the Advisory Committee of Maine's Offshore Wind Roadmap Process. My name's David Plum, and my role here is to help facilitate this advisory committee and its meetings. We've got a very interesting conversation today that will focus around some technical reports and some initial draft recommendations. We're on Zoom today. This is a Zoom webinar where the folks you see on the screen are either advisory committee members or some consultants or members of the CBI team. And we welcome everybody who's joining us in the webinar, listening in to our work today. We invite folks who are listening in to use the MaineOffshoreWind.org website as a way to channel comments. Those comments make their way back to this committee and to the working groups. And that's a great way, if you're hearing something today that you want to reflect on, there's a pathway through that website to provide input. So we invite you to do that. Let me turn it over to your co-chairs today to kick us off. We have with us today Admiral Gregory Johnson and Director Dan Burgess for the Governor's Energy Office. So Admiral Johnson, Dan, please take it away.
Over to you, Admiral, if you want to start.
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone. And again, thank you for taking time out of your respective schedules. I know they're all very busy and you have many alternatives, and we appreciate your dedication to this, I think, profoundly important effort that we've undertaken. We're starting to get to the heart of the matter now as we begin to look at some of the initial recommendations that are coming from our working groups. I want to thank the working groups, the chairs, and all the members for the tremendous amount of work that they've done. You know, we have a meeting on average once or, every month, every 2 months, sometimes it's 3 months between meetings, but the working groups have many, many more meetings. They're putting a great deal more effort. And so I want to thank them and the chairs, again, each member of every single working group. The initial recommendations, which I hope that all of you have had time to peruse them and take a look at them. I'd like to remind you that, again, these are very much initial recommendations. This is very much a work in progress. We've tried to do this with great transparency, and as we were putting together the actual advisory group and the various working groups, a concerted, good faith effort to try to get all interested parties into the process and make sure that everybody is heard and respected. And so I would hope that as these recommendations continue to be worked and refined, that we make every effort within the working groups to bring forth recommendations that are a consensus of the entire working group. That may not always be possible, but I hope that it is. And in those cases where we may arise with an issue or a recommendation in which there is consensus, then I would hope that the working group would bring it to the advisory committee, maybe with some background information on what the challenges are to come to consensus, and then let us take a look at it and discuss it and see if we can make any progress, so that at the end of the day we have consensus and we can go forward with the output that we want, which is actually an actionable set of recommendations. So I would like to make that kind of a little bit of a foot stomper as we continue. We've got actually, I think our last meeting that is scheduled is either in November of next year or December. So we've got a year to work this. But we are truly getting to the heart of the matter now. And finally, I'd like to mention the in-person meeting that we're going to have on the 28th of January at the University of Maine. I think that's an exciting opportunity, and I think it's a profoundly important opportunity because we have been doing these Zoom meetings ever since it began, and I just think it's important for us to get together. The way it's going to be structured is the 3-hour meeting, I think it's going to be from 9 to noon, will be the first thing in a conference room up at the University of Maine. Those of you familiar with it, it'll be in Buchanan Hall. And then there'll be a lunch after that. And then there'll be an opportunity in the afternoon for those who are able and so inclined to have a tour of the work. And it's a tremendous amount of work that's being done in the facility, Habib's facility up there. It's not Habib's facility at the University of Maine, but it is a tremendous amount of work. And if you haven't been there and seen the facility that they've built to test the blades on turbine blades and the basin that they have built to test, they can do wind conditions up to anything you'll see in the Gulf of Maine and simulate them. It's an amazing facility. And while it may not impact us, they have one of the largest 3D printing machines in the world or in the country up there. So there's a lot of interesting work going on up there. So I think we something for us to look forward to, and as your time and distance will allow, it would be great if everybody could be there in person. And so I think that concludes my remarks. Over to you, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Admiral. Want to echo those opening remarks. Really appreciative of all of the time and energy that's gone into getting us to where we are today. Really excited to kind of hear the presentations and hear from the consultants who are doing this work, and excited to keep the momentum moving forward. And we did just have a similar in-person meeting for the 1-year anniversary of the Climate Action Plan that I think went very well. So looking forward to duplicating that and to continuing the progress. So looking forward to it today. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Admiral. Okay, so we've sent around an agenda for today. I'll just flash it on the screen right now. What we're going to do, we're going to do a quick flag at our objective structure, the roadmap process, just to orient us. Then we're going to spend a little time hearing from our consultants, and we've worked really hard with them so that they can give us a few key pieces of information about all the work they're doing that helps tee up some of the recommendations that we'll hear from the working group co-chairs. So we'll hear from our consultants. We're then going to spend time hearing from our co-chairs about these initial draft recommendations. And then we're going to spend over an hour having a discussion about that. We'll take a break in the middle here between 3 and 4. But we really want to commit to making some time to having this discussion. So we're working hard to keep those presentations crisp today. Let me just say a few words before turning it over to Stephanie Watson, who's really a key player in keeping this ship moving forward. Remember this graphic we've used before to help explain the different phases of this roadmap process we're embarked in. We're in phase 1 right now, which is the developing initial recommendations. We're having an interesting milestone today where we're actually looking at some of those as an advisory committee. That's going to happen again in January. In fact, you're going to hear from the Fisheries Working Group today that they're eager to present in January, and they'll just give you an update today. So we'll do finishing phase 1 at the end of January. Phase 2 is about taking these initial recommendations, doing some targeted, some proactive and targeted outreach to get feedback on them, refining them, and then presenting back to you in July. And we've moved our, what was a June meeting to July 20th, I believe. So you'll see that show up in your calendars. And that's when the working group co-chairs will come back to you in July with these refined recommendations with a few more months of good thinking baked in. Phase 3 is consolidating all this into a roadmap, and then obviously the roadmap implementation and beyond. What this doesn't show is that some of these recommendations are being acted on either right now or during the early parts of 2022, right? So some of these things are getting spun out sooner because they require earlier action. Not everything needs to wait till November, December 2022 to start working on it, okay? Let me just show this in a different way. In phase 2, which will start in February after you have this January meeting, which variance willing will be in person in Maine, we're going to have these kinds of milestones over the next couple months in early 2022. Okay, where we're going to be proactively going out and trying to share these ideas with folks that may not be at the table right now, either in this advisory committee or in the working groups. And we're going to be pulling that in and trying to make these initial draft recommendations stronger and better and more complete. And we're aiming for this July 20th meeting with the advisory committee, but really from a working group standpoint, aiming for July 1st to be able to put these now final recommendations on the table. Okay, let me just quick turn it over to Stephanie Watson to walk us through what we anticipate the roadmap's going to look like in its objectives. Stephanie?
Great. Thanks, David. Good morning, everyone. I'm Stephanie Watson, Maine Offshore Wind Program Manager in the Governor's Energy Office. Very briefly, I want to continue the theme of setting the stage for hearing the initial recommendations from the working groups today. So we've proposed these 4 goals and 8 objectives for the Maine Offshore Wind Roadmap to you, the advisory committee, and to the working groups in advance of the drafting of the initial recommendations that we'll discuss today. We've refined these based on your feedback and that of the working group members. So our roadmap will include a suite of recommendations that collectively support these goals and these objectives. And we'll hear those initial draft of the working group's recommendations today. These objectives are not listed in any particular order, but I just wanted to set the stage for the rest of the work that you'll hear about today during our meeting. Thanks, David.
Super. Okay, great. Let me stop sharing. So the first thing we're aiming to do is hear from the technical consultants who've been doing some heavy lifting in technical work, particularly around energy markets, around supply chain, and around workforce. And so we've prepped up 3 consultants to do some quick hits, and we've asked them each to take no more than 10 minutes and really give us some powerful quick hits from a technical perspective that will help shape how we hear and how we react to some of these initial draft recommendations we'll hear from your fellow advisory committee members who are the co-chairs of the working group. So I think we're going to start up with the folks from DMV. We have Ari Michaelson here with us. And I'm just looking around. Yep, there you are, Ari. And I want to, Ari, feel free to share your own screen. And DNV has been working with the Energy Markets and Strategy, or Strategies and Markets working group, and helping do some of the technical analysis around energy markets and looking forward. So Ari, let me turn it over to you, and feel free to share your screen.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to join this call. My name is Ari Michaelson. I'm leading the effort for DNV, supporting the Governor's Energy Office and the Energy Markets and Strategies Working Group primarily. We're doing a variety of research looking at the offshore wind market, the potential for wind in the Gulf of Maine, and various socioeconomic impacts. And have been asked to share some of the big picture takeaways, as David just mentioned, really looking at the market and where things are shaping up. So let's jump right in. Looking at the market trends here for wind development, this slide here shows projected growth for fixed and floating offshore wind, both globally on the left and for the US on the right. Worldwide in 2020, there was just about 750 gigawatts of wind currently installed, and about 5% or 35 gigawatts is currently offshore, and that's all fixed bottom offshore. The key takeaway here is that we're seeing, looking out towards 2040 and 2050, we're seeing exponential growth both in the fixed and the floating markets. Globally and in the US. And in the US, we see 279 gigawatts projected by 2050. And that 232 for fixed represents about what we're projecting to be about 27% of the US wind development. And then that floating about 6% of that total. So there's a lot of growth coming, and the US is a high potential area based on the wind resource and the coastline. One of the key drivers here for this market is cost. And let's look at that for a little bit, particularly looking at levelized cost of energy. So the graph on the right shows sort of the projections of differences in levelized cost of energy between floating and fixed. As you can see today, floating is more expensive than fixed bottom offshore wind, as well as onshore wind development. As the floating market's in its early stages, but we see significant cost reductions, 80% for floating by 2050, and even with the 44% reduction of fixed during that same period, the result is that we're seeing cost competitiveness for floating and fixed bottom technologies, especially as we get out towards 2040 to 2050. This graph here is a global graph, but there's similar trends in the US. And there's been some projections done specifically for the Gulf of Maine that it could get as low as $39 per megawatt hour by 2050, which is slightly better than some of these global projections as well. So we have big picture market. We have cost being one of the key drivers there, but I want to look at what's happening sort of short term and long term here in the region. So regionally, there's a lot of activity, as I'm sure you're aware of. We have clean energy goals in New England and really throughout the East Coast, established by legislative order, renewable portfolio standards, executive orders, really driving renewable development all over the place. And including in that is offshore wind procurements that have been announced and potentially coming for most of the New England states and down the East Coast. We have a 35 gigawatt pipeline of offshore wind development in the US, and it's nearly all fixed bottom. And so let's take a look at this graph here on this slide. This is the East Coast pipeline, essentially, and it shows a couple different things, the various developments that are underway, as well as the bathymetry or depth of the ocean. You can see pretty much every one of these points is in that lighter blue area, really less than 60 meters. And so these are all fixed bottom wind developments. What's interesting here is let's look at the Gulf of Maine here, and obviously in the top, we can see a lot of darker blue, and that's sort of that greater than 90 meter depth. And that's going to be a key driver, or one of the key drivers for what we're likely to see in the Gulf of Maine. So let's talk about that a little bit more. Obviously, you're aware of the BOEM designation for 2023. And so looking at the Gulf of Maine, so we have the deep water. We also want to look at a couple other things, wind speed being one. So this is a graph from NREL on the left here. I'm sure many of you may have seen something like this. The key takeaway is that there's high winds in the Gulf of Maine, really with the coastline as well, some of the best offshore wind resource in North America. And then the right-hand picture is just a snapshot of different offshore wind hull technologies. You can see the left piece of that graph here. In shallower water, that's where we see the fixed bottom, really up to 50, 60 meters in depth. And then as you get deeper than that, you're really using floating technology is being what's going to be needed. And so looking at the Gulf of Maine and that deeper water, really that bathymetry suggests that federal water development will be floating wind here in the Gulf of Maine. This is a great opportunity for research and development. Admiral was just talking about the University of Maine research. We have the Volturn concept and is a great area to test out floating technology and really invites more exploration of additional concepts as well. So against this backdrop of the markets, the costs and the technologies, with DNV, we've been working to project what levels of offshore wind are we likely to see in the Gulf of Maine through several different scenarios. So I want to walk folks through the process and our approach here to doing that. So to do this, the first thing that we did is developed electricity demand projections, both for Maine and for New England, looking at varying expectations and commitments regarding load, particularly beneficial electrification, mostly transportation and heating and cooling. And so that demand gives us the bar on the left here. And then from that demand, we're looking at the state renewable portfolio standard commitments, really to understand how much of that demand will be needed to be supplied by renewable resources. So that's where we're seeing 80% by some date, 100% by 2050. That's driving how much of that demand will need to be met by renewables. That's your blue bar. From there, we're looking at, well, what's existing and in the pipeline of renewables that's either operating today or projected to come online, and that includes onshore resources, primarily wind and solar, as well as different offshore commitments from the various states in New England. And so that's that dotted blue line, and then what we're left with is the green bar, which is our estimated, what we're calling the renewable net short. And this is what is additional demand that would need to be filled with renewables. And so our last step here is, well, how can Maine play in that? So we're looking at both the potential for onshore renewables in Maine, and that's both primarily wind and solar, as well as offshore development in the Gulf of Maine for wind to meet that remaining need. So we've developed a variety of different scenarios, really to incorporate and test variations in expected load growth. So that's fluctuating this demand bar a little bit, as well as looking at different potential onshore and offshore resource builds. And so that's includes sort of limited amounts of offshore development up to onshore wind and solar amounts that triple or quadruple current installations in Maine. So I don't have hard numbers for you today. The draft results are out for review currently, but I want to share some high-level projections of results here, and this is for offshore wind development in the Gulf of Maine. And I'll describe this briefly. The lighter green here on these graphs is development really to meet Maine electricity needs, and that's a subset of New England needs, which is shown in the dark green. So a couple key takeaways as we look at this over time. So in 2030, we consistently see across all of the scenarios that we're looking at that the only development in the Gulf of Maine is the Research Array and the Monhegan project by 2030. By 2040, as we see demand projections increase, we're starting to see more offshore wind development, both to meet Maine and regional needs. And then by 2050, at the bottom right here, the key takeaway is really for all the scenarios that we're looking at, we're seeing substantial offshore wind development in the Gulf of Maine to meet New England needs. So we're still refining these numbers, and so the actual numbers may change, but we're expecting these trends to continue into our final results. These are out with the Energy Markets and Strategies Working Group, and we're expecting comments back before the holidays, but wanted to share this big picture takeaway with the advisory committee here. So just to summarize with a couple key takeaways. Number one, the federal water bathymetry in the Gulf of Maine, generally greater than 16 meters deep, is really shifting that focus to floating offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine. This is a great opportunity for research and development, for infrastructure development, as we'll hear from some of the other consultants on the call today, and even for policy development. There's growing competitiveness of offshore fixed and floating wind, especially looking out to 2050. We talked about the levelized cost of energy. Floating wind also has some benefits on the capacity factor side, which might help that be a stronger play looking in the out years. And finally, in all the draft scenarios that we're looking at here, the regional demand and the projected growth there is a key driver for significant offshore wind development in the Gulf of Maine, particularly as we get out to 2050. With that, just to highlight our next steps. So as I mentioned, we're looking to get some comments back on our draft scenarios and expect to have another iteration available probably late January to share with the working groups and more broadly with the advisory committee and beyond. So with that, I'll thank you for the time, and I think I'll pass it back to David, and maybe we'll take questions at the end. Is that right?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Ari. That's really helpful. What we're going to do is we're going to do these 3 presentations back to back and then have a consolidated moment for questions. So if you have a burning question, jot it down on a piece of paper or do something so you don't forget it. And then we're going to do the 2 more, one on supply chain and one on workforce, and then we'll do some consolidated Q&A and clarifying questions. The next one we will do is around supply chain. And there we have Jamie McDonald here from Exodus, which has been doing that work. So Jamie, take it away, please.
Hey, good morning, everyone, and then thank you for the time and consideration for listening to this presentation today. We've been looking at the Maine supply chain and the opportunities for Maine companies to get involved in offshore wind. And our sub-consultants, BW, who you'll hear from next, have been looking at the workforce aspects of offshore wind. Task one for us was to really get a good understanding of the baseline of the supply chain in Massachusetts and perform an opportunity analysis for the various subsectors of offshore wind and where Maine companies could be involved. To do that, we looked at dissecting what other states had done in terms of the supply chain assessment playbook and what's really triggered and driven that over the past 5 years. And I really want to draw your attention to some key things in these charts for 3 states we've listed here. And that's the stars, which indicate that a lease has been issued. The crosses, which show state policy or commitments that states have made towards procuring offshore wind, and then the circles, which show offtake agreements being signed with the state and an offshore wind project. I think this is, to draw your attention to this, I think it's important to show that any strategic plans and programs, supply chain opportunities, or infrastructure investment has typically followed those big announcements from the state and really giving confidence in the supply chain to establish and really grow and make those commitments to land and in the state. I think it's important to highlight that while we don't necessarily have the stars or the crosses or the circles yet in Maine, we are getting ahead of the game. So by dissecting what other states are doing and enacting strategic plans and programs and doing these studies now, you're really able to take advantage of learning from what the other states have done, what studies and investments make sense for Maine, so that when you do have the star, when you do have the cross and the circle, you're ready to really accelerate into those opportunities. So I just wanted to highlight that as a comparison of what other states are doing there. Looking at the near-term market, we looked at all the projects that we consider as up and coming all the way up to the New York Bight auction. And I think this is important to show just the opportunities that will be available along the East Coast across up until 2034. We've done this analysis till. I think it really shows that in 2025 and 2026, we estimate that there will be 12 projects that will be installing concurrently. Now, they will all be doing different parts of their installation, but the demand that puts on services from a marine logistics perspective, from a ports perspective, vessel requirements perspective will be significant and represents significant opportunities for Maine to be involved in those projects. We took a look at the supply chain baseline for Maine. I'm not going to dwell on this slide very long, but we have looked at the number of companies that do have capabilities to support the offshore wind sector and have already supported the offshore wind sector. So we're not starting from a blank slate here. We do already see some strengths that Maine have, and they should be leveraged and exported up and down nationally and on a global scale. Fixed wind really does present a significant opportunity for the Maine supply chain. The slide I just shows that there's 12 projects that will, within the coming decade, that will be installing balance of plant concurrently. That could equate to anything between 25 to 40 vessels operating off the US East Coast installing that equipment. A typical fixed project, from a case study analysis that we've done on a project in Scotland to provide some context, all the vessels involved in the effort of constructing that project have resulted in 540 vessel days spent in port. So a significant volume of time of interim mobilizations, crew changes, etc., spent across multiple ports. Now, yes, they will normally choose one construction port, which will take up, say, 50 to 60% of that number, but there's a lot of supporting ports that really do provide services to the main construction port. So that represents a lot of direct and indirect opportunities for Maine. There's obviously the opportunity to support with the need for vessels, so particularly crew transfer vessels. Significant opportunity there for Maine with companies in boat building expressing to us a desire to be involved and actively pursuing those opportunities. There's opportunities when it comes to, like I said, vessel mobilization, interim mobilization, and demobilization. So that can include, fuel and freshwater bunkering, food stores replenishment, stevedoring, CFAS supplies and welding, general vessel service repairing, associated haulage, and then all the adjacent services, your hotels, personnel transport, etc. So I think while we have a forward-facing view in that, the projects off the coast of Maine will be floating, there's a real opportunity for Maine companies to gain experience, build relationships on fixed projects, and really take those learnings into what will be a predominantly floating market for the Gulf of Maine. I've spoken about these as I've gone through, but I just want to highlight the top 5 takeaways we are seeing. So really seizing that fixed wind opportunity to enhance your floating wind market position. I think we all appreciate that floating wind is the end goal in some ways for Maine in terms of where they see you really, becoming a center of excellence in that market. So the top 5 takeaways we looked at are dissecting the offshore wind states playbook. We have to look at what everybody else is doing and we understand what it means for Maine, so that we're not just replicating the playbook for the sake of it. We're actually strategically understanding what other states have done and what's going to be useful for Maine to do. A key takeaway was regional collaboration along New England and getting broad agreement that this needs to happen, but Maine needs to prioritize what it means for the state in order to engage. And I think really getting ahead of this in terms of regional collaboration, understanding what Maine wants to get out of it, so that when other states do come to the table, you're ready and prepared to take advantage of regional collaboration. Looking at business attraction, and this is the next steps for us in terms of the reports, but choosing the right tier 1, but understanding the needs of all tier 1s. So while it's probably unlikely that we're going to see a Vestas or a GE land in Maine in the near term, we want to be prepared and understand that if they do come to the table, we understand exactly their needs and what could be done for them if they were to choose Maine as a location, but setting up so that we're looking at things like floating foundations and cables and moorings, and they are tier 1s that potentially could have use throughout the floating market and the East Coast market, and really set Maine up for that floating opportunity. 4th one is to leverage those key exportable opportunities. So strengths in project development, we have seen strengths in research and development and the cross section between AI and data science, making sure we leverage those opportunities and export them up and down the East Coast. And finally, the 5th one was balancing the project pipeline opportunity for supply chain with stakeholder management. I think we've seen some states look at accelerating wind energy areas, and for us in Maine, it's about balancing that with stakeholder engagement, good quality research projects, engagement and understanding the impacts to the environment, and making sure that we're taking a really balanced approach to progressing the offshore wind pipeline opportunity in Maine.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. Really helpful. Again, we're going to switch gears and go straight into the workforce presentation. Feel free, if you have questions you don't want to forget, you could drop those in the chat as well. And after we have this last presentation, we'll have several, 15 minutes or so for Q&A. So we've got Nate with us as well from BW Research, Nate Hunt. Nate, go ahead, please.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for the intro, David. My name is Nate Hunt. I'm a project manager at BW Research. We are working, as Jamie said, as a subcontractor with Exodus, and we're doing really the wind workforce side and kind of looking at the opportunities for the state going forward and the workers within the state. So there's really kind of three main phases of this presentation. First, I'm going to talk about our initial potential offshore wind workforce analysis. So we looked at kind of the estimated demand for offshore wind workers, and then we kind of mapped that to what Maine can actually supply in terms of workforce. Next, we looked and considered kind of Maine's competitive advantages from a workforce perspective, and what kind of opportunities the state can not only excel in domestically, but as Jamie was mentioning earlier, kind of export to other states that are either working on fixed or floating, but Maine can kind of export those services regardless. And then I'll cover kind of our next steps in the research. So for the potential offshore wind workforce assessment, our first step was to model kind of the employment impacts of the 155 megawatt kind of non-commercial projects that are already planned to at least begin construction by 2026. So we're really kind of looking in the short term here. In the longer term, some of those higher gigawatts that Ari was talking about by 2050, that was a little bit beyond what we were looking at. We were really focusing on kind of the before 2030 mark. But so we modeled the employment kind of projections and the overall kind of demand of number of workers, and we mapped that back to kind of specific occupations by looking at industry reports that really approximate what kind of specific occupations are needed for each phase of the offshore wind project. And so doing that gave us 117 key occupations. And overall, we found that, Maine's education and training provider systems and existing workforce can likely meet and kind of absorb this, this additional anticipated need. But there will be some additional kind of need for specialization and particular emphasis on offshore wind specific activities, certifications, et cetera, which I'll get into in a bit. But this initial workforce assessment gave us kind of an idea of the overall demand, so the net kind of total occupations that we're thinking about, and then also the gaps. So when we think about that total demand number and we compare that to the supply that the education and training providers are able to provide and the number of unemployed workers in those specific occupations, we were kind of able to look at the difference. And then we also kind of made sure to look at kind of the education level for each of these occupations, breaking it out by, with a bachelor's degree or more, or less than a bachelor's degree. And then finally, given that, we're kind of in a world where the fixed is transitioning to the floating, we made sure to kind of talk with folks and look into some research to determine like what kinds of occupations would be in greater demand in the floating kind of world compared to the fixed. And so in this workforce assessment, we looked into what are the kind of most in-demand certifications we found that GWO, Global Wind Organization certifications were really kind of a key trademark of that. Health and safety trainings, ISO and OSHA, were also in high demand, but also a lot of skills around fabrication, manufacturing. So welding, CNC machining, electricians, composite technicians, et cetera. And for a lot of the most in-demand occupations that we identified, we created career pathways. So looking at kind of what an entry-level career would look like, or an entry-level job would look like, and how does that transition to a mid and senior level role, and what do you kind of need as you progress. For the occupations that also had kind of the greatest demand that we identified, we looked at the opportunity to transition unemployed workers that are in adjacent occupations. So adjacent occupations are occupations that have similar skills and abilities that would allow workers in those occupations or with those skill sets to transition to the in-demand occupations that we identified with relatively little, upskilling or reskilling or anything like that. And we found that, unemployment numbers are a little in fluctuation these days, but about 600 workers were currently unemployed in these adjacent occupations. And then we also did a deep dive into kind of and created an inventory of the training and education institutions throughout the state, looking at what specific roles they could play in each of the particular sectors and occupations that we were looking in. And so we have a pretty thorough layout in the report on that. The second phase is we looked at what is Maine's competitive workforce advantage. So as along the East Coast, a lot of fixed offshore wind is kind of that initial growth stage. What can Maine kind of export? What services? What human capital can really kind of maybe cut their teeth on some of the projects that are down there, so that when some of the floating activity starts to come around, those workers are already well versed in offshore wind activities. We really identified three main areas in this: offshore wind and really floating offshore wind research and development. I know Admiral Johnson mentioned the UMaine's Advanced Structures and Composite Center, and that's really kind of what we see a critical center for not only developing talent, but also attracting talent to Maine and making Maine really kind of a center for floating offshore wind research and development. We also, took note of Maine's pretty substantial surveying, permitting, and kind of marine activities workforce. So this chart down here actually highlights concentration of occupations. So location quotient is basically a number, and if that number is greater than 1, then that occupation has a greater concentration within that state than the national average. And so you can see from the chart that there's really the 2 bars that jump out the most. This green one, zoologists and wildlife biologists, and then this black bar, that's actually 8 times the national average for marine engineers and naval architects. So you can kind of see right away that Maine really does have a concentration of this talent pool. And even among kind of the smaller bars here are still substantial. It's just the scale is a little bit distorted because of those marine engineers. But environmental scientists and geoscientists, surveying and mapping technicians, and atmospheric atmospheric and space scientists also have kind of relatively high concentrations to the national average. And when we look at those concentrations relative to kind of surrounding states or states down the eastern seaboard, you can really see that Maine has a lot to offer in terms of workforce, particularly for states like New York, New Jersey, but even in some states like closer by, Massachusetts and Connecticut, where some of those surveying and mapping technicians are kind of in lower concentrations there. And then finally, kind of the opportunity that we identified was the existing kind of mariners and marine facilities workforces in Maine. offshore wind presents a great opportunity to kind of supplement mariners' income, whether it's through wildlife observing roles or helping boats navigate these kind of new offshore wind structures and making sure that fishing nets aren't fouled. There are kind of opportunities to capitalize on what Maine kind of already has as a strong suit. In terms of next steps, we're going to be holding a number four virtual stakeholder meetings on January 4th and January 5th. One is for education and training providers. So really trying to see what education and training providers are thinking about when it comes to offshore wind, and maybe trying to crosswalk some of the demand expectations that we see and matching that to potential partners on that side. We're also going to be holding meetings with industry associations and employers, organized labor, and relevant state agencies. I'm kind of moving quickly through this because I know we're short on time, but if anybody is interested in joining their relevant meeting here, please reach out to myself or Maria Millar-Povic or Jonathan Poole. And with that, I think I can hand this back to David.
Wonderful. Okay. Thanks so much, Nate. All right. So 3 little snapshots of some of the technical work that's been going on, supporting some of the working group activity. We have 10 minutes or so for some clarifying questions for our consultants. So advisory committee members, if you have thoughts or questions for them, please share. So Terry, I see your hands up. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks, David. This question is for Ari. That cost slide that you had up kind of caught my attention. It looks like right now the cost is like $250 per kilowatt or gigawatt, whatever, and it drops down to, in 2025, it drops down into the 50 gigawatt, $50 range. So the project that they're citing out here, will that be based on that 2021 number or the 2025? And then a follow-up to that is, you're hoping to get the cost down to $39 per watt, a gigawatt or whatever you said, I can't remember. But I went and got my CMP bill, and it looks like for the first 50 kilowatts, I get charged $14.20 a kilowatt. And for the rest of them, I get charged 9 cents. So, I mean, how the hell is the average person supposed to afford this in their light bill? I'm just thinking about the people, because we have a lot of people that are dependent in the state of Maine on the LIHEAP programs, help with their heating programs, because it's an expensive state to live in. Just wondering if we should be thinking, this group should be thinking about ways to be able to help people along with their bills. If we're gonna put this upon them, people are gonna need help with their electrical bills. So what are your thoughts on that, Ari?
Yeah, thanks, Terry, for that question. I guess just to clarify, so we're looking at, what we were showing was levelized cost of energy per megawatt hour, and that's looking at sort of cost to build these things. So it's a little bit different than maybe what we see on our bills. I don't know, I'm not intimately familiar with the costs used in sort of the research array there. We are projecting pretty quick declines in the pricing for floating sort of as the market matures. It's sort of the next 10 years are critical for the floating market, and with development happening throughout the world, that's where we're projecting those costs to come down.
Thanks, Ari. And Dan, I wonder if you want to weigh in a little bit on that in addition to the question you have, so we make sure we're not comparing apples to oranges in terms of those numbers.
Yeah, it's a really important question about how do we, not just for offshore wind, but the entire state, ensure that we're reducing costs where possible. And I think what we're seeing this winter is as a result of the pandemic and supply chain and supply and demand imbalances in oil and gas that our heating fuel and heating prices are going up this winter. And same with our electricity costs, which are currently driven by natural gas prices. And so I think it's a really important discussion to have as we think about how to get homegrown resources in Maine and be less dependent on, a global marketplace for electricity and energy, how we do that cost effectively. And so I'm hoping that we can spend more time as a group talking about the best ways to do that and how to really looking towards the energy working group too, to help advise on if there's to be development of offshore wind, how to do it most cost effectively. I was going to ask a different question, David, just to clarifying on the last presentation, the quotient numbers by state. I missed it. What's the best way to think about it? Is that a per capita number, Nate? I missed the description of what those numbers looked like. It showed, it's interested to see that we're in have high numbers in a few of those areas. So just want to make sure I understood where that came from.
Yeah, so at the highest level, it's concentration of those jobs relative to the national average. So roughly speaking, if the number was 8, that would be 8 times more concentrated than the national average. And I'm happy to kind of go through the math, but I don't know if we want to jump into that right now.
Right. It's not absolute numbers. It's the percentage as a percentage of population and then relative to the other states.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it. Thanks.
Thanks. Patrice, good morning.
Good morning. Oops, I'm off screen here. I actually had a question for Ari, a question for Nate, and just sort of a general question. So I'll be quick. For Ari, starting on slide 6 and moving forward, when you're characterizing the renewable net short and trying to predict what the demand will be for these renewables, I didn't see a scale on any of those graphs. So I'm just curious, what is the renewable net short, I guess, in gigawatts? And then when you did your scenario planning, I wasn't clear on whether those included both offshore wind and the land-based options and sort of what we were generally looking at. And then finally, do those scenarios look at the grid transmission and infrastructure needs, or are they strictly a demand-based sort of independent of tying in and delivering?
Sure. Thanks, Patrice. Let me hit those. So we purposely didn't see any numbers there. And I think that's primarily because the results are in draft and the Energy Markets and Strategies Working Group is working through that. So we did look at a couple of different levels of demand. And so that graph you're referring to was really sort of trying to show the theory behind how we're thinking of that. To your question about what resources, yes, we're looking at onshore and offshore development. One of the key factors on the onshore is being able to connect it to transmission, which is related to your third question. And so we have some scenarios where there's very little additional onshore development, and then some scenarios where onshore wind and onshore solar is 3 or 4 or 5 times what is there today, sort of looking at the current pipeline and sort of an aggressive projection of onshore development. We're sort of leveraging some of the past work from the Governor's Energy Office, sort of projecting there's sort of this big technical potential, and then there's sort of, well, what's more realistic, and trying to get to those numbers. And then your final question on transmission, to hit it quickly, we do have another piece of our analysis that is looking at how what are the transmission impacts, sort of both onshore and offshore from this projection. And they're not going to give us hard numbers of transmission costs, but they're looking at, okay, well, if it's this far away, this is what you need to be thinking about. Here are the different technologies. Here are the best practices. And that sort of speaks to a little bit of what Jamie was talking about too, in terms of sort of the regional coordination and sort of doing that effectively, because we're likely to see development in the Gulf of Maine, for Maine and maybe for other New England states as well.
Great. Well, I'll look forward to seeing those actual numbers, because obviously that's a huge concern for the fishing industry and a lot of the planning that we need to do really depends upon the scale at which we're looking at. So I appreciate your work. Quick question for Nate. On your slide 7, where you broke out the relative job sectors nationally, at the top of the slide, you mentioned main strength with mariners, which I'm assuming includes the fishing industry, but I didn't see that they were in the bar graphs on the bottom, so I wasn't 100%, I guess, following that.
Yeah, I think the industry is obviously a strength of the state. And we see that as an opportunity for like supplemental income. We're not talking about trying to, poach mariners or something like that. So that's kind of why they weren't included in that chart.
Okay, it would be great to include them. I think they're an important part of the discussion, whether it's for displacement or re-engaging in a different way in the workforce. I just feel like that's everything to us. So I'd love to go from a bullet to a bar graph. I think that would be really helpful to help our sector engage on this. And I guess just my overall comment is, I mean, this is really tremendous work. I understand the need to identify the opportunities. There's a lot to this, but I'm still left with feeling like, are we characterizing the existing maritime industries that are there, particularly the fishing industry? And will we be able to really characterize what some of the costs are, the trade-offs, the potential loss of jobs, or reconcentrating jobs into a single port and taking them away from multiple harbors and those sorts of things? So I just want to, I appreciate the need to identify opportunities in that side, but let's not forget that all of this comes with costs and trade-offs. And if we can find a way to do a better job of characterizing and addressing that, I think we're going to have a much more meaningful conversation with those people who are ultimately going to be impacted when these developments move forward. So that's all I got, David. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrice.
I just want to jump in, David, and just, sorry,
Yeah,
real
go
quick
ahead,
to say, Nate and Patrice, I'd love to have a follow-on conversation about, what would be the next steps to include lobstermen and fishermen in that maritime qualification, given the certifications that need to happen there.
Great. Okay. And I think one of the things, and Ari had mentioned it rapidly, he didn't present on the socioeconomic work that they're doing as well. And I think when we come back together in January, we'll look at that a little bit more. And I think that's going to start to get more at what Patrice is saying about this bigger picture of benefit and cost and opportunity and challenge. Let's take a few more. I see Tom and Grant. Tom, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, first it's just a sort of response to Terry to be sure we're understanding scale correctly on the chart for cost. 250 is $250 a megawatt hour, which is 25 cents a kilowatt hour, going down to $39 a megawatt hour, which is 3.9 cents a kilowatt hour. And to give you a sense of where that stands relative to what we're paying now, I think, and Dan, correct me, I think the new standard offer is around 8 or 9 cents a kilowatt hour. So if you look at the trajectory of the cost will come down ultimately for even floating offshore wind, which is the more expensive variety, to something below what people are paying now, but it's going to take a while to get there. So one of the things we're looking at in the Energy Working Group is, exactly what are the implications of that? What are the affordability issues relating to that? And what is it that we need to do on the energy side and the production side for Maine's offshore wind development itself in order to sustain all the things that people were talking about in terms of centers of excellence and workplace development. So it's not as if we have forgotten about the affordability issues. It's how much benefit can you gain from making the investment at some cost in order to achieve the greater benefits down the road.
Thanks, Tom. Tom, could you say those numbers just one more time for everybody who might be listening in today? A project that costs that $39.
Yeah, I mean, right. I mean, for one thing, the numbers, when you're actually running the wind, the marginal cost is very close to zero. But when you show those figures, you're saying over the lifetime of this project, what's the average cost per kilowatt, per megawatt hour? And they use megawatt hours, which is slightly confusing because people pay in kilowatt hours. But having said that, if you look at the chart, starts at about 250, that's 25 cents per kilowatt hour. going down to $39 per megawatt hour, which is 3.9 cents per kilowatt hour.
Right.
So, the average electric bill in Maine is what, somewhere between 15 and 20 cents all in per kilowatt hour. So that gives you a sense of where this acts in relationship to current prices.
Thanks, Tom. That's super helpful. Yeah. Grant, go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, David. This is a question for Nate. I was wondering if you could speak about how developers and states are engaging with organized labor, and is it common on commercial projects?
Yeah, thanks, Grant. So I know that Phil, who is actually the vice president of BW Research, who couldn't actually make it this morning, but I know that he has spoken with a number of folks, and I know that we're, through our stakeholder engagement meetings, we're hoping to get a number of people signed up for that. And I think I don't have the list right now, but I can pull it up in a second. We already have a number of folks signed up for that. As for how common it is, I'm not sure entirely. I think that, generally it's sought after to bring everybody in, but I don't know specifics on it.
Maybe we can get back to you with that, Grant, see if we can get those numbers for you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Habib, last word, and then we'll switch gears and start hearing from our co-chairs.
I just want to thank Ari and Nate for really excellent presentations here. Just want to shed a little bit more on the question that was asked about cost. The numbers that we've worked with the National Renewable Energy Lab really tie cost to scale. Basically, the bigger the projects are that you're going to build, the lesser the cost per unit is going to be. So the key to driving costs down is really getting to scale. If the numbers we've shown is that when you get to about a gigawatt of capacity using 15 megawatt turbines, which is the next generation turbines, we should be able to get down to that 5.9 cents a kilowatt hour by in that 2030 range. So I know there was a question about when can we get, how soon can we get the cost down? It's an issue of scale. So we need to crank these things out to drive the cost down. That's the bottom line.
Thanks, Habib. Okay, great. Okay, all right. So that's a little technical window. And thanks everyone for comments. And I think there's really some pending questions there. So maybe as soon as our January meeting, we can circle back on some of those pending questions and see if we can do a better job of answering them. All right. So what we wanted to do now before we take a break, which we'll do a little past 10:30, is we wanted to give the co-chairs a chance to just walk us through highlights of these initial draft recommendations. This is not a substitute for actually reading the document that I forwarded around to everybody last week. But this is an opportunity for the co-chairs to say, yep, these are the headlines of what we're trying to do. So we are going to run these through again, I think without questions, because we want to take a break and come back and spend an hour or a little bit more actually talking about this. So let's get right to it. The first working group we wanted to tee up, and let me just do a quick aside to say, today we're going to hear from all 4 working groups, and what you're going to hear from Fisheries Working Group is an update, and we'll get their initial draft recommendations in January, but you'll hear from all 4 today. We'll start with Energy Markets and Strategy. And I can share my screen with slides. And so I'll turn it over to Selena Cunningham, who's one of the co-chairs of that working group, to walk us through these headlines of where the group's been having their discussions on draft recommendations. So Selena, I'll pull up my screens and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, David. So as David mentioned, the Energy Markets and Strategies Working Group has been working through a number of recommendations. And I'll just start by saying that these are still in discussion where as the work that Ari went through is continuing to be finalized. That will help inform our work. And so this is, we're still working through this, but wanted to at least preview what the topics that we're talking about and how how we're thinking about it. So next slide, please.
Oops, hang on one second. I'm racing too fast on you. There you go.
So what we are seeing from the energy needs for the region, and most likely in terms of the state, is that over the long term, the offshore wind will be an important part of our energy mix to meet our clean energy and emission reduction requirements. This includes scenarios that have varying levels of additional load growth from beneficial electrification. So that I think is an important distinction too. And so the working group is working through recommendation around an offshore wind target and a phased procurement process. We are still working through the specific energy target and the timing, but generally thinking about initiating the phased approach sometime after the first federal commercial lease sale and continuing further out as our needs grow. And the reason for the initial investment is given the long development timeline and the infrastructure and supplies chain investments that are needed to prepare for those projects. And as we heard earlier from the slide, that initiating and starting expressing the state's commitment can help develop and attract the industry to base components of the work here in Maine. So I know that the supply chain group will speak more to that linkage, but something that we're looking at. And we see that the PUC would play a role in terms of making sure these are competitive procurement process for the development. And an important part of this discussion is also to ensure that we are pursuing a cost-effective energy strategy for the state. And so both in this recommendation and then in the next one, that is certainly something top of mind for our working group and the things that we're talking through about how to ensure that early investment can help, can be helpful, but also mindful of how to make sure that we're cost effectively pursuing this strategy. And so in terms of the additional analysis that we will use to form this recommendation, we'll finalize the energy needs scenario. We'll also look at the best practices and recommendations around procurement strategies that the consultants are working with us on. And then we'll have continued conversation around the cost piece. So we can move into that next, David. Next slide. Okay, so I think as Habib's aptly put, there is a need for strategic investment in order to lower the cost of the long term. And so we see investing in public-private partnerships to accelerate research and development, to support the offshore wind industry as an important direction to lower costs. We also want to pursue and encourage industry to pursue federal funding, tax credits, and other mechanisms to support offshore wind development projects. And then also think about how that funding can help support various aspects of it, whether it be port infrastructure, supply chain, workforce training, other ways that we can seek funding outside of the traditional energy cost structure. So we do see that the costs are lowering significantly over as Ari put forward. But we also need to have a very, very thoughtful approach and strategy in the state to ensure that the energy is cost effective for the state. So next slide. As we think about the development, I think all of the working groups and the state has been thinking about how to work collaboratively with the region. And we do that in varying forms already through we have existing organizations, regional groups that we have all worked with New Hampshire and Massachusetts. But I think that what we have been talking about is how can we build on existing efforts or create new entities or processes to ensure that we are working collaboratively where it makes sense for the state, identifying specific areas for strategic leadership for the state, but also recognizing that we will not be able to fulfill all of our needs from an energy standpoint, and I mean, all the jobs and components of the development. And so really working with our neighboring the region to determine how to both cost effectively but strategically benefit for all ratepayers and citizens. So we are looking at a variety of different approaches, including an example that has been used in kind of the mid-Atlantic, Maryland, North Carolina, and Virginia have put forward a memorandum of understanding to collaborate on components of the growing offshore wind industry. So we're having a speaker from Virginia come to our next offshore wind working group meeting to share what they did and try to learn from that. So that's just one example of the types of collaboration that we're thinking about. And so you can go to the next slide, David. And then one more, actually. In addition to that, we haven't quite delved into it, but the other areas that we're thinking about is from a siting permitting standpoint. As I know, other working groups are also looking at how our existing state requirements are shaped and whether that's workable or other ways that they can be improved to be clear, efficient, and minimize and mitigate any impacts. So we'll start looking at that at some point. And then also a big component of our work that we have yet to do is around offshore transmission, including actually an onshore component as well, but looking at cost-effective strategies and ways to minimize impact around that. And we will be working with other working groups on the transmission topic as well, but wanted to give you a preview of future potential recommendation areas.
Super. Thanks so much, Selena. That's really great. We're just going to keep rolling. I'm going to drop in the chat some questions that we will use to guide our conversation after we get back from the break, just sort of as food for thought as you're listening to these. We're going to keep moving forward into the next working group, which is sometimes I call the super group, which is supply chain, workforce, ports, and marine transportation. We're going to have sort of 3 blocks on this: supply chain, then workforce, then ports, in the recommendations that are ready to share with you today. Co-chair Steve Van Vogt is here. I hope.
You're unmuted. Yes.
Yes. Thanks, Steve. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. As always, I'd like to start by thanking our industry members for their time and their expertise, which they've so generously offered to this project. They all have day jobs, and so the time that they invest is coming out of their goodness of their hearts and their interest in the state. We have a number of recommendations. I'll let you read them and I'll try and provide some color. The first one, I think we're looking for clarity. Everyone's looking for clarity. We're looking for clarity, and we'd like to see it combined with consistency. I've been in the offshore wind business for 10 years. I have seen a lot of different things happen, but I'm still here and a lot of the things around me have changed. We're also interested in strategic effort. We want to see it applied in a strategic way. Next recommendation. Similarly, we'd like to see advocacy. We'd like to see advocacy on the part of the state through its policies, through its economic outreach, for Maine's firms and industry, for our ports, for our workforce, and for our excellent R&D related to offshore wind. We'd like to see long-term consistent support, because this is a long-term industry and our presence here has to be clear and consistent. Next recommendation, please. Similarly, we would like to see a consistent and high-level strategic effort to align Maine's assets, whatever they are, across industry, R&D, education, workforce development, to market opportunities. That's an important thing to be done, and the closer and more carefully we focus that alignment, the better off we as a state are going to be, and the more likely we are to participate fully in the development of offshore wind. Next recommendation. Lastly, we'd like to see an effort by Maine to pursue regional collaboration at a number of levels, and those include the R&D level, but they also include the government level. But most importantly, we'd like to see an effort to collaborate at the developer and the project level. That's going to be the place where we have the greatest impact. Next slide, please. Summary of the recommendations we just skipped over, and then we're going to go to some areas where we'd like further discussion. We're very excited about the work being done by Exodus. We like to see them drill down into where our assets are and where our expertise lies, and help us identify where those opportunities are. We're also interested in capitalizing on our boat building industry. As the previous presentation showed, there's going to be a lot of boats moving around. We'd like to capitalize on our marine heritage and our expertise in those areas. I think that one of the most important things that we can look for is an effort across state government policy and economic development to assist us in penetrating these markets. Thanks. Done.
Fantastic. Thanks, Steve. And again, that's a high level. I encourage folks to look through when we're going to have a break in a moment. If you haven't already, look through the more detailed version. There's a lot more in there about some detail in those action areas. We are cooking along. We're going to go to workforce development here, and this Jonathan Poole from DECD will walk you through that.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, David. I just want to start off by saying that, we put a lot of time as a working group, collected a lot of feedback and developed these recommendations, and they are not final. We're still open to feedback. They're still in revision. We're still working through a lot of topics that we need to discuss and a lot of information we still need to gather from the experts in our working group. That being said, let me dive in here and I'll go quick because we need to get through a lot. So our first recommendation is to strengthen the offshore wind career exploration opportunities for K-12 and CTE students. This is a inclusive economic development opportunity, ranging the full scale of labor participation. So we want to engage students early and educate them on the opportunities that exist, both on opportunities that require further education at traditional four-year institutions or opportunities that require kind of technical education from a institute of higher education that is not a four-year institution. That includes, expanding Maine's 27 career technical education centers to generate a talent pool and expand internship and work-based learning programs throughout the field. So next slide. Second recommendation is to increase Maine's offshore wind opportunities in Maine's post-secondary education. So Maine has had a lot of success, or used to have a lot of success, in the UMaine Pulp and Paper Foundation, generating talent for the pulp and paper industry. And it was a program that demonstrated significant success, and a replicable program for the offshore wind industry could model that success. Support university research and development, both at public and private universities. Leverage Maine Maritime Academy and NMCC's training programs in the maritime sector, which is hugely important. Maine as a maritime state, we all agree, but improving the professional certifications in the maritime sector is what is going to be required by a lot of these developers and operators coming into the Gulf of Maine. Coordinate with Maine quality centers and declare University of Maine as a center of national excellence for floating offshore wind. Promote higher education to retain and attract talent. That's been one of Maine's successes for, I guess, centuries, looking back at all of our educational institutions, but figuring out how to attract talent here and keep them here has been a challenge, but we're getting better, and we're going to continue to get people into Maine or education land and keep them here. So next slide. Enhance and expand offshore wind training and apprenticeship opportunities like the Maine Apprenticeship Program, where in 2019, I have their annual report here. They had 2,813 apprentices actively working with hundreds of different Maine employers who both leverage organized labor and open shops, including some of the businesses likely represented on this call had over 100 apprentices in their pipeline. So it's a valuable program that continues to be leveraged by Maine's largest and some of Maine's smallest employers to develop those skills and increase the wages for the workers. Develop an offshore wind industry cluster. And as Nate said in his presentation, pursue national certifications and standards like the GWO certifications, the ISO certifications, and OSHA standards. And then part of this, as we all know, is ensure that social infrastructure is in place to attract and retain workers and make sure that they're supported, can execute their responsibilities for whatever firm they choose to sign on with, but making sure that Maine is a supportive place for workforce housing and other necessary social infrastructure that's required to support a growing workforce. Next slide. Encourage high quality jobs. So we need to ensure sufficient workforce training, safety and health protections, and develop and expand existing high-tech industries into offshore wind. Maine is developed and will continue to develop certain advanced technologies. We have long been a center of innovation, but continuing to apply those to the offshore wind sector because, as we know, innovation often drives economic development and increased wages. So using that ability to innovate and apply high-tech industries in Maine to the offshore wind sector will result in those higher wages and increased workforce attraction. Next slide. Sorry, I'm rapidly going through this. And then promote equity and workforce development, which is to address equity and barriers to participation in offshore wind jobs, to open up training opportunities to ensure Maine can attract and develop high-skilled workers, and look for partners to, like the new Mainers Resource Center, to increase the participation across Maine's entire population and future population to ensure that this is an open and accessible industry to get into. Next slide. And then this is one of the most important, but coordinate and collaborate regionally to attract skilled workers. Maine's 10-year economic development strategy said that we need to attract 75,000 net new workers to Maine's economy in a few years, and that has continued to become a challenge. It's got a pandemic bump from a lot of people moving to Maine, but continuing to attract workers from all different sectors, all different skill levels to come to Maine and participate in the workforce from Kittery to Eastport, all the way up and down the coast to ensure that, you know, Maine's coastal communities and inland communities can continue to thrive. And we're going to leverage, for example, the Maine Opportunity Maine tax credit, which has had a lot of success in one of the few programs like that exists, and then develop regional workforce strategies. I think I stayed under time there, David.
Fantastic.
Hopefully I left enough time for Matt.
Excellent. Absolutely. Thanks, Jonathan. Matt, you're up to do ports.
Okay. Can everybody hear me okay?
Oh yeah, you're good.
Okay. Okay, so we'll fly through the recommendations here. Recommendation number one for the ports aspect of our working group is the state should move forward with port development plans with urgency. Obviously, the Moffitt and Nichols study has kind of come forth with two separate concepts, and it's kind of demonstrated the fact that Searsport is an ideal hub location for offshore wind infrastructure in the state of Maine. Other sites that have been made available, for the purpose of the study, should also be considered to kind of reinforce that concept of making the entire port really a hub location, and also, kind of with that, as the state moves forward with port development plans, there's obviously a necessity for a very robust environmental and regulatory process with a a very lengthy stakeholder and public process tied into that as well. So while it's not in the bullets here, I mean, essentially what that means is the development of some sort of Port of Sears Port Advisory Committee to help, share information and discuss the very important topics that are associated with a project of this scale. Next slide. Maine should discuss with neighboring states the region's offshore wind goals and role of floating technology. I think, from as evidenced by the presentations we heard, there's going to be a large transition to floating technology. I think the overwhelming majority of the working group felt that Maine was very well positioned and had a competitive advantage in the floating kind of group. So really understanding the state and regions, other state and regions goals is going to be critical for kind of putting the path forward for our own infrastructure plans if we intend to manufacture or construct any of these wind turbines in the state of Maine. I think the overwhelming majority of the group found that floating offshore wind is the future focus for Maine moving forward, and that the state could provide infrastructure to drive the market on the U.S. East Coast. Next slide. Recommendation 3, Maine should discuss with offshore wind developers the infrastructure needs of other offshore wind projects to best inform the state on our infrastructure plans. I think that's a good idea from the standpoint of, it's helpful to have feedback from, tier 1, manufacturers and developers to know exactly what some of the specific infrastructure requirements are. One example of that could be to solicit an RFI to collect data from those, those tier 1s and other developers. So I think that is a good idea. And really what the crux of that is the port infrastructure should be, designed to accommodate multiple foundation types or equipment types, so that Maine maintains its competitive advantage in floating. Next slide. Impacts to ocean users should be considered and studied in ports that could potentially exist to support offshore wind. I think primarily what I'm talking about right now is Searsport, but other ports, if identified for facilities, should also be included in that. I think bottom line, the scale of these projects is quite large. It could be very easy for offshore wind to kind of dominate the mainstay or the role of a certain port in the state. So I think we should be cognizant of that. And I think the working group felt that way too, that those impacts should be studied so that offshore wind doesn't, dominate that particular port or facility, and other ocean users have the ability to benefit from the services of that port. I think it would be wise, and the recommendation is that the state should consider improvements that simultaneously meet multiple users' needs. So, killing two birds with one stone, I think, is important to consider when we make investments here with infrastructure. Next slide. Recommendation 5, continue the ongoing work in evaluating multiple sites statewide to support offshore wind port infrastructure. That ties in very well with the Moffett and Nickel Phase 2 study, where we're looking at other port facilities in the state and kind of trying to identify roles for them to support offshore wind. Again, with the concept that Searsport's kind of the hub location. I think the working group agrees that the investment should occur in phases as Maine matures with the offshore wind industry. There is not going to be a scenario where multiple facilities come online all at once. This is going to be something that's phased throughout, the next decade or two. The working group feels that having sites evaluated early in the process will help market opportunities to developers as they, gain interest in the state of Maine. Next slide. And then finally, the recommendation, obviously these projects that are being considered are quite massive, hundreds of millions of dollars, to develop infrastructure like this. So the recommendation here is to pursue federal funding to develop offshore wind port infrastructure. I just want to caveat that and say, while it is urgent to find funding streams and identify that, we can't apply for any sort of funding assistance until we actually have a project. So it's critical that the project or whatever direction the state decides to go with port development for offshore wind, that we have a fully fleshed out project. We know what we're building, we know the location, we know what the role of the facility is going to be. So moving a bit further down the road, in preliminary design to help gap fill and answer questions and also really start the public process is, I think, critical to the pursuit of federal funding. I think the working group can help. Oh,
sorry.
No problem. The working group can help leverage funding for port infrastructure now. I think in our working group, we have a tremendous amount of, knowledge with how to, get federal funding, coupled with the ability of the state DOT to do that on large infrastructure projects. So I think we have a lot of knowledge and expertise in that realm. And I also think it's important, the working group feels it's important to begin discussions with the federal delegation and federal agencies to identify funding paths for projects like this. And I think that's it, David.
Yep. I think that's it. There's some overarching comments here that I'm not sure anybody wants to speak to in terms of the co-chairs. These are things that the working group hasn't yet made recommendations on or wants to do some additional work. Let's turn now to the Environmental and Wildlife Working Group. We have co-chairs with us. We have Wing Goodale, we've got John Perry. I think, Wing, you're going to do this. So I'll just advance slides as you need, Wing.
All right, great. You can hear me all right, David?
Yep, you're good.
Awesome. Hello, all, and good to see you all virtually. So as a group, we've been focused on conversations on how can the state best position and empower itself during conversations with the federal government and others around siting offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine in relation to environment and wildlife. And there's sort of a couple important themes overall. I think we're all aware that BOEM is now identifying the Gulf of Maine as an area that they are going to pursue to identify wind energy areas. And given that's going to happen over the next 3 years or so, we really want to think about what can be done now, within, say, the next 8 months to a year time frame to get the state in a good position for conversations. And then secondly, what can we start to do as far as a data collection perspective to make sure that we're going to be filling key data gaps? One of the overall themes in our conversation is that there is a lack of data in the Gulf of Maine. So it's something that we need to realize, and then that using existing data, that we necessarily are dealing with uncertainty. And uncertainty too is present in the fact that the data that we have naturally is from the past, and that the Gulf of Maine, we're all well aware of, is changing due to climate change. And in any predictions we're going to try to do today, looking forward, we have to recognize that the Gulf is changing and that these are our best guesses now, but things are going to change in the future. And then lastly, we've been discussing a lot about how to prioritize. As we think about siting, we can't have everything be a priority. So how do we prioritize? And that's going to be an ongoing discussion, and particularly when you start thinking about thresholds. So those are sort of overall themes. So sort of the first real focus here is this sort of question of avoidance. So how do we avoid areas where there may be the greatest potential conflict between environment and wildlife in offshore wind? And the first recommendation here is to use existing data to map, to identify areas of greatest conflict and identify data gaps that need to be filled to inform offshore wind leasing. So there's going to be sort of a four-part process here. It's going to be aggregate data in the Northeast Ocean Data Portal, and then integrate areas of high fishing use based on the fisheries working group process. And one thing I should note is that there's really strong coordination between the Environment and Wildlife Working Group and the Fisheries Working Group. And there's a lot of synergies between those groups. And we've been working on really tight communication between the groups, and DMR is present on both groups and are sort of a key coordinating cog between the two. So we're going to work with this existing data to identify areas of greatest conflict, yet we recognize that there are these data gaps. And so what we want to make sure is we leverage the knowledge and expertise in the Gulf of Maine, both from the expert scientist side and from the fisheries side. So the thought will be is that we'll do initial mapping, bring folks together with high levels of expertise, adjust maps, and then come to sort of an interim map with the idea that this mapping process will be iterative. As we get more information, will be changed as we get new information comes in. Next slide, please. So the second recommendations and the ones that follow here are really focused on starting to fill these data gaps that we're all very well aware of. So recommendation number 2 is to initiate and lead an effort to conduct benthic habitat surveys in areas of the Gulf of Maine, to fill data gaps in prioritized areas. So again, this theme of prioritizing, because to do a good mapping exercise for the entire Gulf would take years and years, right? So we have to do it in areas that we're really focused on, where we think that offshore wind may be pursued in the future. The first step in this is bringing together the stakeholders to understand what data we have, and to really clearly understand where those data gaps are. Next slide, please. Number 3 is to initiate and seek federal funding for a coordinated below and above water ecological baseline monitoring study in areas identified through the mapping of existing data. So there are 2 important pieces here. One is this coordinated below and above water. There's been a lot of discussion about ensuring that we're taking an ecological approach. What can happen in the survey world and in the research world in general is folks are off in their silos doing their pieces, and there isn't a coordinated effort. So that's one thing that has been very important to the group, is that there's a coordinated effort. And how we're going to pursue that is prioritize general fund support and seek additional funding, work with regional partners in New Hampshire and Massachusetts, pursue funding from federal agencies, including BOEM and NOAA, and then develop an integrated survey design to determine exposure risk using a variety of potential methods. And that's one of the things here, is that this will be a interdisciplinary process. Next slide, please. So the next piece is, surveys necessarily are going to be snapshots, right? So you're only seeing what's out there when you're out there. And for rare species, you're less likely to necessarily see them because they're rare. And one way that you can fill that data gap is to do individual tracking work. So recommendation 4 is to conduct tracking studies on ESA listed bird species, as well as marine and non-marine birds, marine mammals, and fish, specifically that have been identified to vulnerable to offshore wind development. And this vulnerability piece has also been sort of a theme on how do we prioritize, because we need to focus research on species or species groups that are known through work to the south of us and over in Europe to be vulnerable to offshore wind. And there are a variety of methods to do this, using different tracking technologies, radars and acoustics, tagging efforts, marine mammal surveys, and then also using the whale catalog to understand areas of high use of individuals. Next slide, please. So this last recommendation takes a slightly different bent and takes us into the policy and regulatory area. And this is to investigate the use of Maine's Federal Consistency Review Authority under the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act to address issues of concern regarding offshore wind development in federal waters, including potential changes to state laws and rules. Now, this is a big bucket, and actually as we go forward, we're going to be exploring this further. And also something that's come up a lot is that CZMA is going to be something that starts to happen once you get into the permitting process. And that importantly, and this is where the previous recommendations are focused, we want to focus on avoidance during this siting process initially. Next slide, please. So to summarize, we're recommending to map existing data to identify areas of greatest conflict and to identify data gaps, to initiate and lead Gulf of Maine benthic habitat surveys, to initiate and seek funding for coordinated below and above water baseline ecological monitoring, to conduct tracking studies on those species that you're going to necessarily miss during surveys, which I should add are, by the nature of them, of course, during the day, and many of the species we're interested in are moving at night. And then finally, explore use of federal consistency. Next slide, please. So as we look forward to future discussions, we've been focused really thinking about sort of offshore wind farms themselves, off in the marine environment. And we've been purposely putting the discussions around transmission cables into the new year. So that's something we're going to be working on next, is considering transmission cable routes and landing considerations. And any of you that worked in the offshore wind world, this is really, really important, and it's all a chain together, right? And we want to make sure that we're thinking about all aspects of our project, from where the power is generated to where the power is delivered. We're also going to be working on development of best management practices for environmentally responsible development. So this is going to be considering what is the kind of information you need for site characterization work? What do you need for doing pre and post construction monitoring? And those can be quite different, actually. And then looking forward to potential mitigation measures. We'll also be looking at procurement requirements and other ways to influence development. So how can the state really leverage potentially buying power in order to make sure that the goals that are going to be laid out in the roadmap are met? And we need policy and regulatory changes to do that. And then finally, I'm going to be providing recommendations around the research consortium, and particularly around research ideas that consortium can focus on. So that's a very quick roundup of it all, and be happy to take questions when the time is right.
Thanks, Wing. That's fantastic. And I will note, Wing, for a lot of the recommendations that your group has been working on, many of them are sort of already underway or sort of ready to go, right? So you guys you're in a space where some of these you're reacting on now and into the new year, in addition to something that'll end up in November or December 2022. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. And that's what we're really focusing on, is what recommendations does the group really feel that need to be just tackled right now. And fortunately, some of those are going to be able to move forward right away.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Wing. Okay, so we've got one more working group, and that is the fisheries working group. And while I do have a slide, I don't, Meredith Mendelson from DMR, would you like me to put that up now?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. That'll just give us a little outline here as I'm talking, David. Thanks. So as David mentioned, we're not presenting draft recommendations here today. I'll give you a little detail on that in a minute. The fisheries working group has been meeting regularly about every 3 weeks through the fall, and most recently last week. At our November meeting, we were joined by staff from the NOAA Fisheries, Northeast Fisheries Science Center, as well as the Greater Atlantic Regional Office, as well as staff from the Habitat Committee of the New England Fishery Management Council. These are 3 individuals who have been really deeply involved in thinking about how offshore wind development is going to impact fisheries from a resource perspective, a habitat perspective, and perhaps of unique interest to this working group, the operations of fishing activity. They've also done a lot of work to identify data gaps and think about how we monitor for change and assess impact, particularly if traditional survey methodologies won't be feasible inside wind farms. So that was really informative. And then last week, we were joined by a fishing industry leader from Long Island, as well as staff from the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. These two folks spoke to their thoughts on how best to have impact in the BOEM leasing process. So these were two really key meetings and kind of informing our next round of draft recommendation development. Overall, we're having really good discussions about some of the issues that we're working on, although I will say the Monhegan test site issues are certainly front of mind in terms of how effective the working group's efforts will be to achieve better outcomes going forward. So that is definitely proving a little bit challenging. As I mentioned at our last meeting, the group has been developing draft recommendations around a range of topics. We have not yet determined that they're ready to be advanced to the advisory committee. We're going to be holding 2 meetings prior to the January advisory committee meeting, with the goal of finalizing a good portion of those, hopefully, and being ready to present them to this group. The categories that we've been working through include things like monitoring requirements before, during, and after construction. So similar to the Environment and Wildlife Working Group in that regard, both inside and outside the farm, as well as along cable corridors. The group is also working on issues related to survey methodologies, data transparency, and funding for research. We've also put forward draft recommendations related to how the state should encourage BOEM and offshore wind developers to communicate with the fishing industry during, again, all phases of project construction, pre, during, and post. And I anticipate that those may be built out further as well in our January meetings. Currently, BOEM is soliciting input on a scoping document related to fisheries mitigation and compensation strategies. I think it's possible that additional recommendations may be generated as a result of collective thinking through that process. There's also been a good deal of discussion recently around the need for mechanisms to ensure accountability to other recommendations. So I think it's possible that something might germinate on that topic as well. Wing noted, and I also agree, as I mentioned before at the last meeting, that we continue to see really good coordination and synergy with the Environment and Wildlife Working Group's conversations, specifically around the future discussions that Wing identified on development of best management practices for management and monitoring, and also ways to influence development. As well as some of the recommendations they've already developed, such as the need to identify priority habitats for protection and assess impacts on endangered species. So that's all I have for now. I'm going to turn to Terry in case he has anything to add.
Yeah, I do actually. Thanks, Meredith. Of course, right, David?
Most glad.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this weekend, when I was looking over the document, and these recommendations that are coming out of each individual working group are a net positive for those working groups. What we're looking at right now, the industry is using that area now, and we're going to lose that area once those wind farms are in there. So whatever we come up with for recommendations is going to be a net negative for a financial hardship for each one of these individual fishing and businesses that work in there. So I just wanted people to bear in mind why we're struggling more than probably the people who are trying to bring jobs into the state or trying to build up the infrastructure around the state, because each one of these recommendations are going to come out of us eventually are going to be a net negative for us. And I've had lots of conversation with different fishermen, and people are really nervous, especially with BOEM's announcement of expanding that area over a couple of weeks ago. So anyway, I just wanted people to bear that in mind as we're working on our different groups working on their different recommendations. Thank you.
Thanks, Terry, and thanks, Meredith. Okay, That was an enormous amount of content we just walked through. And you can see the breadth of work that's happening, the conversations that are going on. And that isn't even the detailed version, right? The detailed version's in that packet you had in the pre-read. Let's take a 10-minute break and come back at the top of the hour and just sit with this and have a conversation together. We have some tools to do that. And Laura Singer had dropped in the chat some questions. Those are the questions we're going to kick off with when we come back together at the top of the hour. So if you want to take a peek at those and maybe do some thinking around them, like where are things complementary, and aligned? Where might we have some natural or misalignments or internal contradictions in what we're saying? Because we need to address those if we do. And the final question there, which is particularly important, is which actions or investments are most strategically important for Maine right now? Okay, after hearing all this and reading it. So let's take a 10-minute break. We'll be back at the top of the hour. See you back in 10 minutes. Quick bio break. Thanks, everybody. We'll be right back. Again. All right, folks, welcome back. That was a pretty quick break, but we're on track to finish up at noon as scheduled. So what we wanted to do is start to exercise our own brains around what we're hearing, that breadth of work we just heard from before the break. Thanks, Will, for dropping in the chat some responses to the questions that Laura had put in the chat earlier. We're going to do a somewhat more systematic approach to working through this. And while we do, Laura, if you have a link to that briefing packet that the advisory committee got, we can drop that link in the chat for all observers as well to be able to have that briefing packet so they can see the more detailed recommendations. I will flag for everybody that, again, this is draft work. This is subject to change. This is work in progress. So that is a pretty significant caveat. Great. Okay, so Maggie or Samanish, could you drop in the chat the Menti link poll, please? Great. So Maggie just dropped in the chat a poll, and we did this in July, if you'll remember when we were all together in July over Zoom. And this is a way that we can all write in. It works really well with short responses, like a phrase or a short sentence. And we've got two questions we want to do this way, and we're going to pause between them and look at them. So if you click on that link, the first question we're going to work with together is this. What are the recommendations? Where are the recommendations most aligned or complementary? These working groups were working independently, with crossover from Gio, from me and Laura and others and some of the co-chairs, but we had sort of independent thinking that was going on. And now that we can look at them together, where are we seeing complementary aligned ideas? So I'll invite all of you to click on that link that Maggie put in the chat. Think about a short answer here. Again, a phrase or a short sentence, and just write something. And I invite all advisory committee members to just write something in here. And when Maggie starts to get some responses, Maggie can share a screen and we can see what's coming in. So if anybody has any questions, what I'm asking you to do, shout out right now. There's a link in the chat for advisory committee members. Go ahead and click on it and answer that first question, please. And Maggie, I'll leave it up to you when you start to see a number of responses come in if you want to share your screen. Okay. Or Samanish.
We have a handful now. I'll just give it another minute or so.
Thanks. And no concerns if you can't figure out what I'm asking you to do, just shout out, be like, David, what are you asking me to do? No shame in that. Okay. So what you'll start to see on your screen is what you've been writing about these alignments, what's complementary, what seems to be working well together. I'll let you all just read it the same way I am. Great. So you'll see what's in what you all been writing, right? Clear alignment between what environment, wildlife, and fisheries working groups are doing. That's encouraging to see that that's working well. There feels to be consistency and alignment between how the supply chain and workforce and energy strategies and markets are working together. Trying to be inclusive of perspectives, that's a great thing to see. And the fact that Maine needs a firm state level policy commitment to signal where it wants to go. Okay. This is great. I wonder if anybody wants, on this topic of where you're seeing this alignment, are there other things folks want to say or elaborate on before we go to the next question? Anything about this folks want to just highlight on any of these points? Don?
Well, in some ways, just to state the obvious, but I think, people have alluded to priorities, and I think the next step, which I assume will happen after the turn of the year, of really getting serious about timeline and priorities is a critical piece to seeing how this begins to fit together. Because there's stuff that just has to be happening yesterday, and there's other stuff that's a decade away, and it begins to get digestible when you take a kind of a no nonsense priority look over time.
Thanks, Don. Yeah. Are there other things people want to shout out about on these topics in this idea of what we're hearing that feels aligned or complementary or working together? Okay, great. Well, let's keep this in mind. This is really helpful. So Maggie, if you want to advance us to the next question, you can click on that Menti link all over again, click it one more time, or go back to that same browser window you had open, and it'll ask you to move to the next question. So go ahead and click on it again, or move to the next question in that same browser window you just had open. And there's your next question. All right. And this is the one about potential misalignments, right? What do we need to be conscious of as we're striving for coherence, or as Don says, as we're looking to set some priorities? Where do we need to be thoughtful, because we're not quite hitting the right mark yet in terms of this alignment or potential contradiction? I'll give folks a moment to think. And Maggie, as you start to see responses come in, you think you have a critical mass, feel free to share your screen. Okay. Okay, so we've got some questions around misalignments about timing. We've got some questions about interests, and are interests fundamentally aligned around this? We have some questions around making sure we're being straight up about costs and benefits. And I can see some of these interesting comments around, let's be really clear what's in our control and what's not in our control. And so we react accordingly, perhaps increase our control, as Wing was, put out in that recommendation on how we understand coastal zone management. Right. There's some questions about labor agreements, how we feel about that, and how much federal funding really will be available. Okay. All right. So there's some big issues there that are going to be issues that we're going to need to wrestle with at the working group level, and that you as an advisory committee are particularly well situated to do some thoughtful analysis and agreement building amongst yourselves, because these are natural tensions that are bubbling up. Okay. Do folks want to comment more on any of these? Okay. Don?
Yeah, I think I would suggest that one of the things we need to get crystal clear about is, who are our customers here? And just to me, there are three that are obvious. The first is utility ratepayers. The politics of this discussion really happen when you open up your monthly statement in some ways. The second is the fishing community, who is faced with giving up, losing ground. And the third is developers, offshore wind developers, who, if we're not relevant to them, if we're not serving their needs, then we're going to miss. And I think to the degree one of us decides that only one of those matters or one of them doesn't matter, we really miss the point going forward.
Thanks, Don. Right. Who are we talking to through this roadmap process? Yeah. Tom Welch?
Yeah, I threw something in the chat, but I think the question of who our audience is actually, we need to back up a step. The Advisory Council doesn't decide anything. The Advisory Council provides information to the governor's office, the legislature, regulators, that one hopes would enable them to make intelligent decisions. And for that reason, I don't think it's useful or important, or even a good idea, to try to mask the differences that are going to emerge as we go through this process of evaluating what the opportunities and costs are of moving forward with offshore wind. So the framework that I sort of think about is, okay, what do these people need to make intelligent decisions? And then the question is, what are we trying to achieve here? Lower carbon, better equity in Maine's employment, and then how can offshore wind contribute to those, and at what cost? And I think this is where you get the issues of, the fisheries. There is a cost. It's where you get to the issues of ratepayer impact. So I think what we should be sure as we go through the process of identifying areas of agreement, we don't lose sight of the fact that there are a lot of areas where, we don't have the information yet. We can't really make a firm judgment on exactly how to move forward. And we need to be sure that we provide information to people who actually will be proposing and passing legislation to effectuate this. Both the subtleties involved, the complexities involved, the magnitude and timing of the opportunities and costs, and what is important to do now, what needs to wait for further data. So I think, I'm just hoping that we're not, as an advisory committee, thinking, okay, we're going to give them one recommendation and walk away. I think the document that I envision is one that has very substantial discussion, data, an acknowledgement of the complexity and various risks and opportunities.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks. Will?
Yeah, jumping off of, I guess, both Tom and Don's point, I think this notion that many of us were, to some varying degrees, comfortable with where we were going as a state with the research array, and then things got a little murkier with the BOEM announcement. And I think the kind of change that needs to occur on the urgency of filling some of the data gaps to make ourselves informed customers, in all three of Don's kind of ways, moving forward so that we are making informed decisions as a state. And I think, really looking at, what needs to occur this field season, what needs to occur, and kind of being really clear about that and how we're going to fund that to get us back to a place where I think, some of us, maybe not all of us, felt more comfortable, with just the research array being on the horizon for the next 5 years.
Thanks, Will. Yep. Terry, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so just a couple of the comments about the fisheries working group that were written down there. I, for one, as a fisherman and a group member, am here because I know it's inevitable that offshore wind is coming, because I've seen it in Southern New England. And my job here is to minimize the impact on the fishing industry. And that's the way I see it anyway. And, and work within this group to do that. So it's not that it's a non-starter for us. It's that we want to minimize the impact on the fishing industry. So as we're going forward.
Thanks, Terry. Thank you very much for that. Meredith? Excuse me, Wing, then Meredith?
Yeah, I just want to sort of emphasize what came up in some of those comments, this tension between urgency on one hand and wanting to be data rich and informed for decision making. And, I think it's going to be a tension throughout this. And I think, at least in my mind, I'm trying to think about it in different timelines. So what can we do with what we have now? Because there's going to be some needs very soon to be in conversations with the federal government about siting with the data that we have. Yet we also need to be forward looking on how do we deal with the uncertainty we have both with climate change and our lack of data. And how do we, it's sort of this classic problem, how do we make decisions in this world of uncertainty, knowing that we have to make decisions now as we move forward. So I think this is going to be an ongoing tension between we got to do something now because decisions are coming up because of climate change for a variety of reasons, but also a discomfort with making decisions when we don't have the best information that we'd like to make those decisions.
Thanks, Wing. Yep, absolutely. Meredith?
I'm not quite sure my thoughts have coalesced yet, but Terry and Wing both kind of touched on things I was going to say. I'm bristling, honestly, when I see comments that that members of the fishing industry are obstructing this process, because I think it frankly undermines the reality that there are legitimate questions about the impacts of this technology on the marine environment. I don't think there's any question that that the objections or concerns being identified by the Environment and Wildlife Working Group are legitimate. So I just want to say, in sort of defense of the fishing industry, and particularly this working group, which has come to the table, I think, in really good faith and participated in some really difficult conversations, that is not the conversation we're having. And I think I just would ask again that this group keep an open mind about the concerns that are being raised, because they're no different, frankly, than the concerns that are being raised by the supply chain working group, by the ports working group. There are a lot of obstacles to overcome here. And so the fisheries working group is raising things that they think are legitimate and, important to address. And we have to work through those in the same way. Thanks.
Thanks, Meredith. Yep. Grant, go ahead.
Thanks. I'd just like to use this time to kind of advocate for a good public campaign. Just going over the port feasibility report, which was an excellent report. Well done, Matt. But we're going to have to, educate the public as much as possible to get them on board, so we don't reach such hard resistance with every step of the way. Cofferdams and backfilling is going to be a little bit of a stretch for environmentalists to get behind, I think, currently. But as we move forward, the more we can educate the public and grow support in that way, the less we can get jammed up by them later on down the road. And then finally, I am going to put my name and my contact information in the chat as far as the workforce group goes. And if anybody would like to reach out and collaborate with me, agree with me or not, I'm just here to do the best I can for the workforce group. And I would look forward to any engagement with anyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Grant. Yep. Suzanne.
Hey, everybody. I've got a couple of comments. Actually, I would like to start by piggybacking on what Grant just had to say. Seeing that Hannah is joining us today, I've been thinking a little bit about the climate action plan and the decision to add a section around engaging with Maine people. And I'm sorry that I don't know the exact title of that section, but I've been thinking a lot about that as well. Whenever you're relaying the information like we did in the reports at the outset of this meeting, it's incredibly technical and difficult to understand what it means for Maine people. And everybody wants to go right back to their light bill, right, Terry? Like, what does this even mean? How do you convert from megawatt hours to kilowatt hours? And, I just think there is a certain amount of this that maybe it's in a marketing plan, but I think it might be nice to think about a particular section that is around making this information more accessible to Maine people, including affected industries. If we can't all follow along, which I understand that's not the point of this advisory committee, we're sort of expected to know this language, but it just has me thinking about how do we keep our eye towards helping all Mainers understand the work of what's going on here. The comments on the fisheries piece, I'm not directly participating in that working group, but I also want to say how I think it's really discouraging knowing how hard folks are trying to find better solutions and outcomes, that we're still seeing those concerns and perspectives shared, that it's feeling disruptive and not helpful and an endless cause. I think to the point of data collection being a bit more comprehensive and truly understanding, we talk about this as an economic gain, and I think in many ways it absolutely is an important and incredibly important thing, particularly in terms of climate and what that is doing to our fisheries, that we need to have this conversation. But I do think, to be fair, there are economic implications. There are activities that will be disrupted or changed. And I think helping us all understand that and will help us be more focused on coming up with better solutions. And so I think the points today around how does the workforce data, make sure that we're capturing the potential opportunity with the mariners, to the idea, I think if I understand correctly, the suggestions around the ports side of things, characterizing what's actually happening there already at the outset, at the same time that we're looking at offshore wind capabilities and not looking at all those other needs and uses sort of after the fact. Can we do that kind of comprehensively from the outset, is something that I'm really interested in. And the last thing I would just say, it's great to go to the lab at UMaine. I think many of us have been there and been awed by how things have progressed and changed over the years. But I do just wonder for this group, if we have the opportunity to get together, if we might be able to go down to a wharf somewhere at part of this process and actually be on the water and talk to folks and understand in a more constructive way what the potential implications are going to be. I've had the chance to do that over the years from folks at the state and federal level. And I think we've all learned a lot by going down to the waterfront to have some of these conversations. And I just think it might help us to have a more productive and richer conversation about this work moving forward. So thanks.
Thanks, Suzanne. Steve, go ahead, please. Hang on, Steve, you're still muted.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you're good now.
Apologize. I would second what Suzanne's just said. And as part of a company that has worked around the world in offshore oil, gas, wind, and other things, we're not the first people to have to come to terms with our fishing community. And we would be well advised to understand what's happened in Scotland, Japan, any number of other places. Because we're not the first people to confront this issue. Last comment I would say is that it's probably not up to Maine to control any of this, including climate change and the development of the Gulf of Maine exclusively. That's just a reality check.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah. Terry, back to you.
I'd just like to offer up my wharf if the group would like to meet down here in Cundy's Harbor. We have a nice, beautiful wharf that a lot of our lobstermen would fish in that area that I kind of meet at.
Thanks, Terry. Nice invitation. Okay. All right. Tom?
Yeah, just a quick, comment on the comment from the fisheries folks. I don't perceive their comments as negative at all. I mean, I think I view the effort that group is putting in as an extremely important development of input into a process over which Maine has no control. If Maine is going to have its voice heard and its fishing industry is going to be relevant to what's going on in federal waters controlled by the federal government, that has to be an important element of what's going on here. And so I don't see anything inconsistent or contrarian or negative about the concerns and issues that are raised. I think obviously it's helpful if part of what's going on there is, here are the particularly important areas, here are the ways in which things can be mitigated, here are the things in which, when those federal waters are exploited, the effect can be a positive one for Maine, or at least minimally negative. But I don't know where the comment comes from that somehow the fisheries group is being viewed as negative, because I certainly don't view it that way, and I'd be surprised if anybody else on this committee views it that way.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah. Okay, so what I want to push us to think about is a third question now. And we're not going to do it in the Menti, we'll just do it together. And it's about thinking sort of what next. And Dawn Perkins signaled this a little bit around, we're going to have to start to talk about priorities pretty soon. And I'm just curious if we were to test that conversation now, we're not committing to anything, we're just sort of testing it on the basis of what we've heard and what we've read in these initial draft recommendations. What are critically important actions and investments and other moves that Maine needs to take right now? Where do we want to go? Feel free to drop things in the chat. Feel free to say things. Wing, go ahead, please.
I'll just say, and we talked about this in our recommendations, but there's just an urgent need to start collecting environmental data right now. And that is both on the environmental wildlife side, but also the fisheries side. And there's a really good synergy between the two. The areas that are most productive for the fishermen are also most productive for wildlife. And I think that helps in multiple ways. It helps inform our decision-making. We feel empowered by that. We're able to make decisions with information, and also forward-looking towards potential development. It also helps with the permitting process. And this is what you see to the south, is that broad-based surveys have helped both with siting and then secondly with the permitting process. So the key and challenge in the Gulf of Maine is the size of the Gulf of Maine and how to collect data on a scale that is meaningful on that project level and on the Gulf level. And that can achieve those goals of both supporting these siting questions as well as ultimately project-based questions.
Thanks,
And-
Wing.
And that data is, I tend to think on a bird perspective, but it's just incredibly important below water and above water, and to be synergistic in how you collect that data.
Thanks, Wing. Yep. Terry?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with Wing anymore. And also, not just prior to this construction, but to grab the baseline data, but during and after the construction. Let's not walk away from it once it's constructed and say, okay, it's there. Let's keep that as a priority to do our research and make sure that wind farm is not changing the environmental conditions in that area, because that's, there's a reason the boats are there. The boats are there because the fish are there. The fish are there because the environment's right. There's a reason why the industry fishes in those areas. They don't fish there because there's no fish there. So it's an important area to the industry. So just let's make sure that we don't drop the ball after the construction.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. And I know that's been a central theme in the fisheries working group, sort of very, very draft recommendations that are under consideration. Yeah. Tom, go ahead. And I'm seeing some stuff in the chat too. I'll call out in just a second. Tom, go ahead.
I mean, I think in terms of immediate work, obviously the data collection is high. I think another related one is to begin to build the particular relationships that are going to be needed to participate in the federal processes. I mean, make sure that we have the right inroads, the right people to talk to, the right coalitions that we may want to build with our brethren. And also on the sort of things you can do immediately, I think some legislative initiatives that would be useful to support the workforce development and the research development. I know there's been some of the recommendations address making sure we have sufficient funding for those and are pushing those in the right direction. I think those are all steps you can take right now, even before the rest of the data is in. So I would put those in the immediate category.
You want to say just one more word about that, Tom? What are you thinking specifically?
Yeah, I think there's a fair amount of a number of these recommendations talk about enhancing, supporting Maine's workforce development in the industries that will support what we expect to be a global industry, regardless of what happens in the Gulf of Maine or Maine waters. So moving very quickly to enhancing those, supporting those. I don't know exactly what the right mechanisms would be, but funding that, it seems to me, would help us stay close to the front of the curve in terms of getting those economic values, regardless of where this stuff is developed. If we believe, as I think I do, there's likely to be a worldwide development of floating offshore wind.
Thanks, Tom. That's helpful. Yeah. Meredith, go ahead, please.
Yeah, just reacting to Jeremy's comment in the chat about the need for clarity and predictable regulatory process. I think that's a place where there's actually really a lot of overlap across all of the working groups. I think even stakeholders who are opposed to offshore wind or concerned about offshore wind are also looking for that same kind of clarity in the process. And I think this kind of comes back to a discussion that we've been having or starting to have within the fisheries working group about accountability to hopefully this process and the development of these recommendations across administrations, across time, across changes in development strategy, that we have something to kind of point back to as a set of guideposts that address the needs of varying stakeholders, so that there is this durable process that doesn't have to swing with the political winds. So I think there's really a lot of opportunity to look at that piece. And I think especially because we've got some components kind of ready to go in developing there's work that needs to be done on developing kind of revisions to a regulatory process or thinking through those issues. I think the sooner we can start that work, perhaps the better.
Great. Okay. I want to pull out some of the things that are in the chat as well. Just as Meredith riffed off something that Jeremy had put in the chat. I see higher up from Dawn and from Ben Lucas. And, you know, in addition to the baseline info, talking about advancing Sears Port and other port strategy. And so that's something we've heard in the working groups. I want to test that just with you all generally, and what Dawn Perkins is saying around port strategy. Does that resonate with folks? Is there something folks want to say in addition about ports in Maine's port strategy that is, you know, in that category of really urgent investments? Anything else to say about it? Grant, is that about ports?
Yeah, just a real quick thing. I don't know if we're missing out on a chance to really develop a port so that we could possibly fabricate boats as well for the offshore wind industry, because I think we're going to be making hulls. Just a suggestion out of the box for sure.
Okay, great. So our port strategy is more than just foundations and the like. Let's think about boats. Let's think about other things we could be doing. Okay. The other pieces I'm seeing here in the chat, you know, Ben talking about siting locations and workforce development, and start developing this workforce now. That really echoes some of the I think what Tom had said about legislative initiative or other initiative to get workforce and supply chain moving right away. Ben, if there's anything else you'd like to say about that, feel free to chime in.
No, not at all. And I think, you know, Jeremy went into more detail about, you know, my thoughts on the siting issues. He just must be a faster typer than I am.
Got it. Great. Okay. Super.
Yeah.
What else?
David, I just wanted to say real quick on the workforce. Ben, great point. I think looking at the workforce, you know, should this advisory committee advise that this is a priority that Maine wants to move into, whether it's participating in offshore wind that is outside the Gulf of Maine or inside the Gulf of Maine. There are some quick wins that Maine can do to really ready ourselves to participate in this. And, you know, we aim to include those in our recommendations, but I think that overall there are quick wins and then there are longer infrastructure changes, but there are some easy ones that we can take to get the workforce ready. Those already in the workforce and those that are in adjacent industries that could jump into it.
Thanks, Jonathan. That's great. I just want to circle back to ports for 1 second. I know I don't want to put you on the spot, James, but you know, James or others, are there other things we want to say about ports and port strategy that's important to put on the table now as we're in this moment of sort of mulling initial draft recommendations and priorities and urgent needs? Steve, and then James, Steve, either one.
Well, just a couple of quick comments.
Yeah.
I'd like the development of ports is important across the entire economy of Maine. So everything that's done to support offshore wind, we should have an eye on other things, and that should probably add to the urgency, if nothing else. I think that ports are one of our unique assets and a place that we can play.
Thanks, Steve. That's great.
Yeah, and I add to that, I think it's important to remember or always realize that our 3-port strategy was started back in the early 70s as an environmental strategy. So we didn't have ports popping up all over the coast of the state of Maine. I have some old port books from the 50s and 60s where people were advertising, towns were advertising, you know, come bring your port development to Camden. Bring your port development to Rockland, we'll build it for you. And I think the state very wisely, you know, thought of the future and where can we best develop these industries. And today I've got people in town who have, you know, come more recently that don't really understand that we're trying to protect Maine's environment by building. So we basically have the resource. We have a lot of potential here in Searsport to do this project. And 10 years ago, we didn't even envision this, but I think it's important to realize that and maybe start to coalesce around the idea that we need to look pretty closely at investment in this area.
Thanks. That's really helpful.
Great point, James.
Yeah, great. Jonathan?
Just want to add on ports. I spend a lot of time in the marine sector, but also in the forest product sector. And improved port facilities will not only help the marine heritage industry but also the forest product side as well. Forest products relies on port access a lot, and I think improved port facilities will improve trade for the forest products industry and Maine's other growing industries.
Great, thanks. Tom Welch?
Yeah, just let me reinforce that a little bit. When you ask the question, what can and should you do immediately? One of the considerations should be, if we do the thing we are talking about, is it likely to have positive consequences over a pretty broad range of possible futures? So it's not dependent upon a particular path. I think ports are an excellent example. Regardless of what happens with the floating offshore wind industry, improving Maine's ports is likely to have positive consequences, if I'm hearing things correctly. And it will also benefit our ability to take advantage of the offshore wind industry. So that seems to be this kind of thing that would be a good recommendation coming out of this. Let's spend the money to do it, and here's why, and here are the implications both for the offshore wind and non-offshore wind. There are other actions, and frankly, something like the supporting the array that's already contemplated. There are some futures in which it might not make sense. It does have some cost implications, but it does have a lot of positive things. It's something you can do right now, and it's bounded in terms of its possible negative consequences. So again, that's one you say, yeah, let's push forward with that immediately. Now, the question of to what extent Maine buys into greater amounts of floating offshore wind, or the extent to which Maine supports landing the power from the Gulf of Maine for major projects. Those, it seems to me, are questions that are likely to depend upon the data that we do not have yet. And therefore, those are probably not ones that I would put right at the top of the list. I would not suggest, for example, that Maine go out and make a procurement for 120% of Maine's electricity needs right now, because you just don't know enough. So that's sort of the way in which it may make sense to differentiate what's immediate, what's intermediate, what needs further study. I think another one immediate is, let's fix the regulatory climate in terms of certainty in Maine. Jeremy Payne's point, we've had some rather nasty recent experience with the lack of certainty in Maine. And I think that's one at least to put in front of the decision makers to say, this is a problem that's going to need to be fixed regardless of what your ultimate objectives are, because you are discouraging any kind of investment at the moment. So anyway, it's sort of a putting a framework of decisional criteria over what you propose first, what you propose next, and how you want people to think about what you're telling them.
Thanks, Tom. Those are really helpful frameworks. I've been taking a few notes as folks have been talking, and I'll just share them now as a way to sort of, see if we're capturing some big ideas. Obviously, those two Menti polls were helpful at capturing this. These are my notes right now. Again, they're real time, so please forgive areas where they're not particularly clear. So when we think about sort of overall reactions to what's going on, thinking about our audience, as Dawn asks us to do, which is important, and the fact that we do have at least these three and probably more audiences that are critically important for us. Thinking about our role as an advisory committee to not sort of paper over differences, but to lift up those differences. In my little consensus building heart, I believe there's opportunity for constructive dialogue and creative thinking around those differences. But our role is to lift that up and present good information to the governor's energy office and the state government. There's urgency in filling data gaps. We'll talk about that in a second. And even with that, we will have to deal with uncertainty. So this is a key piece of this, is how are we reducing the uncertainty? And maybe Tom Welch's points just now about the sequence of decisions we make is based on as we feel less and less uncertain about the data and the outlook. We are working in good faith here. There's been some frustrations about how some things were expressed in that second Menti, and some real pushback here to say, folks, everybody's working in good faith on this, and there's legitimate questions that need to be addressed. And oh, by the way, shouldn't we, if we're going to get together, why don't we find a way to get together on the waterfront? That could be particularly helpful as we're navigating some difficult conversations, right? There's multiple folks expressed the importance of public education, public engagement, engaging with Maine people. If people don't feel somehow they have a pathway into this process, there's no way that they're walking along with us in this journey. So we need to be thoughtful about that and maybe replicate, as was mentioned in the climate action plan, where there's a real sort of engage with people section. And then this last point about no regrets actions that are resilient to multiple scenarios that can help multiple pieces of the puzzle, not just offshore wind, and prioritizing areas where we have better data and more certainty. When I asked you about urgent needs, you spoke about the data issue. You spoke about building relationships, particularly as we move into trying to be influential in a federal process. You spoke about supporting workforce and supply chain actions through legislative actions or quick wins or other things. You spoke about this clarity and predictability of the regulatory process, which requires you to start thinking now about what those potential revisions would be, since that's a pretty long road in making revisions to regulatory process. And you spoke about the port strategy. And when you do that, to think again beyond offshore wind, and the strategic aspect of ports for multiple industries. So this is what I captured as notes of what you were saying. We've got just a second more if folks want to say, no, but you forgot this, or what about this, or the other thing's important. So I'll drop my notes, but are there other things folks haven't said that is important to say right now at this juncture in our work? Grant?
I would say just fully Americanizing the supply chain for offshore wind.
Okay. I bet there's multiple viewpoints on that. I bet there's multiple viewpoints on that. Let's put a pin in that one for more discussion, and know that is something that probably several people are going to want to weigh in on. Okay. I wanted to, before we end today and go to next steps, I want to do two things. One is we've had about 45 people or so tuning into our meeting today and listening in. And as I said at the top, a really great way to engage with the advisory committee and working groups is through the offshorewind.org, MaineOffshoreWind.org website in the Contact Us. However, just as we did in July, I'm just going to open it up for 1 second. And Maggie's going to throw in the chat that Menti link again. And the third question that I asked you about which actions and investments are most strategically important. This is actually for folks who have been listening in to our meeting today, not to you as advisory committee members, but let's open it up for folks who have been listening in. If you can click on that link, all the folks who've been observing our meeting today, if you'd like to weigh in on this question, right? And again, advisory committee members, don't answer this time, please. If you'd like to answer this question about which actions or investments are most strategically important for Maine right now, we invite you to click on that link. Okay, and we're just going to let that happen for a little bit. And while that is happening, and we'll show some results to see what we get in just a moment. Again, that's for observers who've been watching our meeting today. While that's happening, we want to talk about next steps. And as has been mentioned by Admiral Johnson and others, our intent is to get together in January at UMaine And we know we're still in the throes of a pandemic, and we want to do a quick Zoom poll with advisory committee members about your appetite for going in person, right? Because we have our views about it, and we want to make sure we know your views. And again, it's still a month and change away, month and a half away. So it's not, we don't really know, but we're just going to do a quick Zoom poll. I wonder, Maggie or Samanish, if you could quickly throw this poll up. We want to test folks' appetite to come together. And we intend to make this a hybrid experience. And I think this Zoom poll will be a helpful test of that. And just, Maggie, do we have that, or do we need a little bit of time to get that?
It's launched right now. Just a reminder that this is just for advisory committee members to respond to the Zoom poll about the January 28th meeting.
Great. Sorry, I had it on my other screen. I didn't know it was up. Thanks. Okay, so again, this is about for advisory committee members. And we know there's a lot of enthusiasm for this. We want to test advisory committee members' appetite. I think we're almost there, Maggie, if you want to share those results. Okay. So we've got a good majority of folks saying yes, would likely intend to attend in person. We've got some maybes, and that's fair enough. You know, we're seeing changes as we go. And there's a handful of folks who said wouldn't likely attend in person. So the mandate we hear from that is we're going to have a hybrid option, and we're going to have a lot of enthusiasm about getting folks in person because of the possibilities behind that. And we'll talk in the future about COVID protocols and all that good stuff. And some, that's right. And Tom, you're going to be out of town. That's right. Probably one of the reasons you said that. Okay. All right. So Maggie, how did we do in getting any response from the folks who are observing our meeting today?
We've got about 15 responses if you want me to share those.
Let's go ahead and look at those. And advisory committee, let's take a peek. Again, this is just raw coming from folks who are observing our meeting today. Another data point. Let's take a minute and just go through these. Great. Okay, so we're seeing ideas on ports, ideas for transparency and outreach, idea for supporting fishermen and fishing communities, leveraging federal dollars, planning for surprises, what I like to call predictable surprises, better characterization of marine and environment, of the marine environment, excuse me, identifying how Maine can have a voice and influence in siting offshore wind, lessons learned from other states, high quality job creation, baseline info. Okay, great. Okay, we'll make sure this is part of our meeting summary as well. And it's helpful to see this, folks. Advisory committee members, any quick reactions to what you just saw from the public? I felt like some echoes from your own conversation. Any reaction besides that? Okay, I saw some nodding heads there. Great. Okay, fantastic. All right, so just as a reminder on next steps, I'll pull my timeline slide I had earlier. Just give me 1 second to get back to that slide deck. So everybody remembers. A little slow today, apologies. Remember, this is our sort of overall timeline slide. We are here finishing up phase one. We're going to get another round of initial draft recommendations in January. We'll have some additional conversation around that and get ourselves ready to go out, do the proactive engagement that we know many of you want to have happen. Think proactively about the conversations we want to have. Spend the spring refining on the basis of that and then move into the summer about finalizing our roadmap. We know that several working groups, including environmental wildlife, are spinning things out right now, right? They're going to do that workshop to pull together data. They're going to do that work well before any of this gets finalized over the summer and the fall. Okay. Before I turn it over to your co-chairs to end, any questions about process? Any questions from advisory committee members about what comes next? Or any parting thoughts that folks want to share before we finish up today? Anything else? Okay, well, great. All right, well, Dan and Grog, Admiral Johnson, I'll turn it over to you to finish us up for the day.
Well, I'd just like to thank everyone. And you, Dave, you run a great meeting. But Ari and Jamie and Nate, thanks for your very thoughtful presentations, and all of that helps inform us and everybody else that's concerned with this issue. And the working group chairs, your presentations again are very helpful. And then I would like to thank everyone for the last hour that we spent. That was incredibly constructive dialogue. I think it's it's the most important dialogue we've had since this has been going, and everybody, I think, gained a much deeper appreciation for the concerns that each other has. I think there's a lot of overlap. I think we all agree that we need to get a little bit more data to be better informed, and we need to do some prioritization. And so again, I just thought it was a very, very positive and constructive meeting, and thank you all, and I'll turn it over to Dan.
Just agree. One of the really thought-provoking to hear the presentations and the conversations. So appreciate everyone sticking with it for all the work they're doing in advance, and then the meeting discussion today was great. And hope we're able to pull off a hybrid meeting so we can see each other in person where possible and continue the dialogue to meet our schedule. It feels like a good process moving forward. So thanks everybody for the time.
Great. Well, we won't meet again until the new year. So happy holidays, everybody. Have some time off. And we'll see each other in the new year. For working groups, we'll see you sooner, most likely. Thanks, everybody, for sticking in there. And really look forward to hopefully seeing you in person in late January. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks, David.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Yep.